Good morning, everyone, and welcome to AEI. We look forward to this discussion today. There's nothing like starting off a Tuesday morning with a little bit of generational warfare, and so we trust you've come prepared. And we'd like to welcome all of those who are viewing from at home or at their desks as well as we kick off this discussion. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker and our respondents, and then we will have our speaker, Joe Sternberg, come up here and offer some remarks, and then his respondents will give their reaction to his remarks, and then that will be followed by a discussion. And then at the appropriate time, we'll break and allow you to weigh in with questions. The title of the book we're here to discuss today is The Theft of a Decade: How Baby Boomers Stole the Millennials' Economic Future. And the author is Joseph Sternberg, who's a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, where he writes the political economics column. He joined the Wall Street Journal in 2006 as an editorial writer in Hong Kong, where he edited the Business Asia column, which is where I first interacted with you years ago. Before that, he was an editor and writer at the New York Sun in the public interest and began his career as a journalist right here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Sternberg is a graduate of the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg. Responding to him today, first is my colleague here at AEI, Ramesh Ponnuru, who's a visiting fellow here and examines the future of conservatism with a lot of attention on healthcare, economic policy, and constitutionalism. Many of you know him as a longtime senior editor for National Review, where he covers national politics and public policy, and you can also find his regular column at Bloomberg View. And finally, joining us as another respondent is Connor Williams, a fellow at the Century Foundation, where he writes about education, immigration, early childhood education, school choice, and work-life balances for American families. He's an expert on American educational inequity, English learner students, dual immersion programs, urban education reform, and the history of progressivism. So welcome to our respondents today, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Joe Sternberg to the podium.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks to all of you for coming. As Ryan pointed out, I started my journalism career here in Washington about 15 years ago, and I fondly remember attending AEI events at the old office. Certainly, I think they're a big draw for young people who are trying to get their bearings and thinking about economic issues, policy questions. And so that means it's very flattering that I've now been invited here to give my own talk, and also a little bit daunting. So I will try to live up to all of the people who have spoken at these events before. And I'm going to do that actually by focusing on two of the big questions that I tackle in the book, economic questions, and then I suspect we're going to talk a little bit about the politics later in the program. The two economic questions that I've been focusing a lot on as I've been talking about this book are, first off, what happened to millennials over the past decade? Because I found that there's a lot of confusion about this point. There's a lot of confusion about whether anything did happen to millennials over the past decade that was unusual compared to what had happened to previous generations. So I'm going to spend a few minutes arguing to you that actually millennials have had a really rough go in the economy over the past decade, and that this is a real problem for us. I'm a millennial myself. That's very unusual to what previous generations have faced. And of course, the second question is, who did it? And so I'm going to argue that actually a lot of what we are living through right now is a result of various policy choices instead of forces of economic nature or the natural evolution of the economy. And I think that this way of thinking about policy choices instead of inevitability should have a big impact on the way some of these issues play out politically over the next few years. So before I get into either of those questions, though, I want to quickly define what a millennial is, because this is the other thing I've discovered a lot of people seem to be really confused about. And the big point is that we're older than you think we are. So when I'm talking about millennials in this talk, I'm looking at a generation that was born around 1981 to 1996. So that means a lot of us were just at the age where we were entering the labor force when the financial panic and the Great Recession hit. And the youngest of us are already out of college. So if you came here expecting me to talk about all of these snowflakes that we hear about on college campuses, you're going to be disappointed. That's not our fault. That is Generation Z, the people who are coming after us. So if we're talking about what happened to millennials, I think that the start and the end of that discussion has to be the labor market. And this is a big part of the story that I tried to tell in the book, because it malfunctioned for us in a spectacular fashion that was really unusual compared to a lot of previous economic downturns that America had been through. Certainly we saw a spike in youth unemployment because we saw a spike in overall unemployment. And of course, young people are always the most vulnerable in any economic downturn. But I think that what made it different this time around was the severity. I mean, we're familiar with thinking about the Great Recession as the worst downturn America had suffered since the Depression. And that means that inevitably young people were going to be hard hit by that. And what exacerbated the fact is that we had an enormous cohort of young people entering the labor market at that time. Depending on how you count, there are anywhere between 71 and 80 million millennials floating around in the American population right now. And so that meant that the economy was trying to absorb an enormous cohort of young, still developing their skills workers during the worst downturn that we had suffered in 80 years. And the other interesting thing about this downturn is that it seemed to affect a lot of different companies differently. And some of the hardest hit companies in this downturn particularly tended to be the smaller companies that young workers are most reliant on for initial job opportunities. And so that meant that you had a lot of unemployed millennials floating around. And you arguably had more unemployed millennials than the unemployment data suggested, because we also lived through a trend where more and more of us were going to school as a form of warehouse for ourselves while we waited for the job market to recover. You can see evidence for that in a spike in attendance at higher education right around the time of the Great Recession. That I don't think is explained just by this normal trend where millennials were always going to go to college in higher numbers than our parents would have done. And you can also detect hints of it in survey data now that suggests that a lot of millennials feel underemployed in their jobs now that they've graduated. I think that one interpretation of that might be that we have unrealistic expectations about doing glamorous work right after we graduate. But I think there's also a strong case that you ended up with a millennial labor force that had acquired a lot of education and training to try to inoculate ourselves against the effects of the downturn, and then discovered that that didn't work for us. Now, these bad labor market dynamics have fed directly into two of the other big things that have happened to millennials over the past decade. One is the student debt crisis that we hear so much about. I mean, one implication of a lot of millennials finding their way into higher education to try to protect themselves from the downturn was a dramatic accumulation of student debt during this period. And then another implication of that is that if the job opportunities still weren't available for us when we graduated, that debt burden seemed so much more unmanageable than it would have been otherwise. And that is an important point that I think casts a new light on some of the politics around the student debt issue right now. Millennials, I think, often feel cheated by some of the investments that we've made in higher education because the labor market returns haven't been there for us as a consequence of the fact that it took the economy such a long time to recover, in terms of the employment situation. The next shoe to drop as a result of the bad labor market that we've suffered over the past 10 years is going to be the housing market. And I think here millennials often find ourselves caught in a catch-22 because the places where there are job opportunities for us tend to be in thriving urban areas, here in Washington, New York, Austin, Texas, Los Angeles, Seattle. But those are the places where housing is least affordable for us. And millennials often find themselves in a trap where the job market, even once you're in a place where you can find a job, isn't quite delivering the wage level that will allow you to afford housing in the areas where you've had to move for work. And I think that is something that is creating a lot of strain for millennials. And I think it's important to understand when we're talking about what happened to millennials is that actually for a lot of people in this generation, it is not a question in the past tense. There's a lot of research that suggests that these effects are going to be very long-lasting for this generation. There's growing evidence to suggest that if you enter the labor market in a downturn when unemployment is unusually high, it will take you a decade or more to recover the cumulative lost earnings that you miss out on earlier in your career. I think that millennials right now find themselves saddled with a lot of long-term student debts that are going to, long outlast the downturn that might have helped push some of us at the margin into additional education. And housing is going to be a real challenge because if you are a millennial now, and again, some of us are older than you think we are. I'm 37. I'm a millennial myself, and people, especially at the older end of the range, who haven't been able to climb onto the housing ladder yet, find themselves wondering if they will ever be able to, and have the house paid off by the time we'd be expecting to retire. So I think that's important to keep in mind if we're having a political discussion a little later this morning, because I think there can be a tendency to think that if the economic growth is very strong now over the past couple years, that has solved a lot of these problems. And I think that it's important to remember that that is helpful, but from the perspective of a lot of millennials, it isn't entirely a satisfactory solution, that there's still a lot of problems lingering out there. Now, the second part of this issue that I want to touch on before we get into the panel is just the question of who did it. Now, of course, I'm arguing that the result of this was that a lot of these phenomena are the result of policy choices, both before, during, and after the financial panic and the Great Recession. Now, that is not always a common view, especially among some boomer economists who, often argue that the transformation America is going through economically right now is a result of demographic change or globalization in some way, or just the normal forces of economic evolution. But I think that there is actually an element of policy choice to a lot of this, and that should inform a lot of the political debates that we have moving forward. One issue I talk a lot about is just the dynamics of investment and productivity growth in the economy. I think that millennials have been living with the consequences, particularly since the Great Recession, of an American economy that increasingly struggles to unlock business investment in enhancing productivity. And you can point to a lot of policies that were part of the baby boomer policy consensus that may have aggravated that. You can point to a lot of regulations or regulatory bias in favor of replacing capital instead of replacing labor instead of augmenting it in the economy. You can point to a lot of education policy environment that places a lot of burdens on 18-year-olds to invest in their own educational future without any guidance from anyone else in the economy about what skills or training will actually be useful for us once we get into the working world. And I do have some sympathy for the boomers in all of this. I mean, and this surprised me a little bit when I was writing the book, because I did expect there to be more generational warfare than maybe there is. I think that the boomers lived through an earlier version of some of these transformations in the economy in the 70s and 80s. I think that the problem was that often they didn't learn quite the right lessons from those experiences, and so the tendency would become to double down on policies that hadn't worked. One issue that I talk a bit about in the book was the boomer tendency to mistake the outputs of a secure economy, such as wage growth, strong labor unions or labor power in the negotiations with employers. There was a boomer tendency to mistake those outputs of productivity growth for inputs into economic security, a tendency to focus on trying to regulate for those things instead of thinking more carefully about how do we boost the investment, the productivity in the economy that will deliver the economic security that we're all looking for. One issue that I think that we're also going to have to talk a little bit about will be something like monetary policy, which feels very obscure to a lot of millennials, but I think is actually a really important part of many of these investment misfires. What was interesting, I think, during the firefighting phase of the financial crisis was the extent to which boomers tried to double down on a housing bias that they had created in the economy. instead of thinking more carefully about whether we were really implementing policies that were going to help particularly the small companies as opposed to the large companies, the small firms that hire more younger people in the economy. And certainly after the Great Recession, we saw a big doubling down in things like a focus on education or trying to upskill aggressively as a solution to an economic problem that the boomers didn't always seem to understand. And that has had a lot of implications for millennials too. So that I think is a broad summary. I've left a lot of little ideas floating around out there that maybe we can latch onto during the discussion and the Q&A. So I don't want to talk very much more than that, just allow some of those ideas to percolate. But I think the big point of this exercise for me was that first there really is a problem. And I think that in order to have a balanced political discussion about a lot of these issues moving forward, I think that both ends of the political spectrum are going to have to realize that millennials, younger voters, are not crazy for thinking that we have serious economic problems that are continuing to linger. And then my final point, which I hope is a theme that comes out clearly in the book, is just a plea for continued creative thinking about a lot of these problems, because clearly millennials are casting around for new solutions, for something that seems to deviate from what felt like a boomer era consensus on how to tackle a lot of these issues. I think that my take on the big political trend, this notion that millennials are invariably gravitating toward the socialist left, is not necessarily that we're entirely persuaded by those arguments, because some of the polling can be a little bit mixed, but that we are looking for more competition in terms of answers to these problems, that we want to see a more dynamic discussion about a lot of that. And so particularly speaking to an audience here at AEI, my plea to people who are on the rightward end of the spectrum or the free market end is to take these problems seriously and really focus intensively on engaging with a lot of the issues that millennials are concerned about right now. And I think I'm just going to leave it there because I feel like I've talked on for a bit much, and I have been talking about the book for about a week now since it was released, and I've discovered that for me, the panel discussion and the Q&A are a lot more fun than the me talking part. And I'm sure that's the case for all of you. So I'm just going to head over and let Connor and Ramesh offer some of their thoughts.
Well, hi, I'm Connor Williams. I'm here just let me offer a few reasons why I'm here. First, I'm here ostensibly because I'm a fellow at the Century Foundation. It's a think tank just up the road, a bit to the left of AEI, and so I'm the ideological diversity today. But I'm also here because I'm a dad, father of 2 children, and I'm here as the youth voice because, according to Joe's book, I'm a year younger than he is. But mostly I'm here because I biked to AEI today. And that's to say, I biked because I like biking. It's just an easy way to get around. But it also saves me in the order of $2,000 to $3,000 a year, according to my calculations, in terms of saved gym memberships, in terms of money I didn't spend on parking or public transit. That is one of the many things I do on a day to week to month to yearly basis to kind of scrimp together enough money for all the other things that I have to pay for, including especially those 2 kids. So that's to say that I'm here because I am, and I want you to filter everything I say for the rest of this through this lens. I am your success sequence. I am every single rule that usually as a conservative on the panel says, those millennials are so promiscuous and they're frivolous and there's avocados on their toast and there's all these. I am the sober-minded man, the one who got a job at 9, saved a ton for his own college, who was in a first-generation college, single-income family of 6, went to college on heavy financial aid, married the girl that I dated in college, in my 20s, had a couple of kids in my 20s, about to have my 3rd, which, again, forgive me, if I just tear out, that's because that's where I'm going. I went to grad school. I kept working there. I have my entire life, everything that the success sequence people say, keep your nose clean and work hard and get a degree and what have you. I did all of that. And I realized something after we had our kids, and this is how I got passionate about this, was I was saving aggressively for retirement. I was putting money in 529s as soon as kids were born to save for their college. I paid down my own student loan debt. We're on our way on my wife's student loan debt. We just weren't getting to any of the milestones as fast as my parents did. I was out earning my dad currently, and I think also, at every stage of my career, out earning him, and still not able to put it all together. And I thought, this just, again, I followed all the rules. I was so ticked off about this. And so I wrote a piece for The Guardian, which is part of how I got here on this stage. Bernie Sanders boosted it on Facebook, which meant that the entire internet gave me feedback. And it turns out that the internet wanted to play a game. For my version of this book, if I ever can scrape together enough money to take the risk, to take the time, congratulations, to actually write my version. The game they want to play is the you should adjust game. So we're going to play now. This is what the mistakes I made. They said, well, you should have just gone to a different college, a cheaper one. You should have just not gone to college. Or if you did go, majored in something else, and then repeat with grad school. You should have just moved to a less safe neighborhood where you live, in the city you live in. You should have just left the city entirely, moved to the suburbs. You should have just left cities and moved to a different region, a cheaper place, a smaller town. You should have just bought a car so you could live in the suburbs. You should have just not bought a car. You should have got a car at a different time. You should have married someone else, married at a different age. You should have not gotten married yet. You should have had kids at a different time, a different number of kids. You should have not had kids at all. You should have had your parents die already. You should have saved more for retirement. You should have used your retirement to buy the house. You should have gotten a side job, another side job, a couple of side jobs. And there were some things they didn't say, which again were all sort of my unearned luck. We'll not call it privilege exactly, because this is just luck. I never really got catastrophically sick. The couple of various accidents and traumas that we went through were all cancer scares, not cancer. They were all minor issues around car accidents and assaults and things like that. They never said, well, you shouldn't have gotten arrested, because I didn't. The point was, all those things are true, right? It is true that all of those choices have a lot to do with upward mobility. It's also the case that I made most of those choices between 18 and 22 or 18 and 25, and at the time was living forwards. Now, understanding backwards, I could have maybe had a better, smoother financial path if I'd majored in something else or had a different number of kids or what have you. But I had no way of knowing that. All I was doing was following the rules, making what were eminently defensible, reasonable choices for somebody my age to make. And it turned out those were, according to the internet, deeply consequential choices that I should kind of feel bad about. And that's what it means to be a youngish. Because, let's be honest, this is about my last ever panel as the youth voice. This will never happen again. To be a youngish working father in the United States right now feels like that. It feels like every choice you make, no matter how serious you take yourself and how anxious you are about it and how carefully you sort of weigh your options, you're always at a much higher risk than you used to be of it just kind of going sideways, and you got an extra 5 years before you can retire. It all goes sideways, and you got into the housing market, but you got in after all the growth had pretty much gone in. That asset's so overvalued now, it's just not going to pay off. So that's what I'm here. I'm the canary in the mine. I'm here to tell you that if a guy like me, who again had college-educated parents, first-gen college, but still, I'm a white guy, I'm a straight guy, I have a PhD, my relationship sort of survived college and survived till now, everything sort of broke my way, and it's taken me a while to put it all together. I warn you that the people who are flocking to radical solutions to our political present, they're flocking because oftentimes they don't have either my luck, my privileges, or just the really defensible choices they made just didn't pan out. And it's not really their fault. It's just that we've made the path so precarious now. So on that, I'll turn to you, Ramesh. I'm sure you'll agree.
Well, Connor is bringing the ideological diversity, as he promised. I'm bringing the generational diversity, being a Gen X guy here. I frankly thought that the book should have talked a little bit more about my generation and our impeccable musical taste, our admirable introversion, and all the other characteristics that make us so universally celebrated. I tend to have a certain allergy towards a kind of generational politics, towards overstatements, generalizations about generations that tend often to exaggerate what different age cohorts have in common and underestimate the diversity within generations. But I liked this book more than I thought I would going in with that predisposition. I thought there were a lot of places where there was nuance and thoughtfulness, and it was throughout very intelligent and humane. I should say I'm allergic to generational politics on both sides. So it is certainly true that particularly as the age profile of American conservatism has gotten older, you are hearing more and more complaints about young people these days. And you hear a lot about the avocado toast. I don't know why that's become quite the flashpoint that it has, but it is. And why are they socialists? And why won't they get married already? And so forth. I don't know that the book has totally avoided some of the pitfalls, though, of that kind of thinking. So many times during it, I would read something about, millennials reporting much higher degrees of worry about their financial future than baby boomers. And I thought, well, is that a cohort effect or is that just an age effect? Is that just something that people in their early 30s are more likely to do than people in their late 50s who presumably have already ideally made and executed their financial plans, or at least have a better sense of how things are turning out for them. I did agree with the emphasis on the huge lingering effects of the Great Recession. I think it is important to think about the well-documented fact that to join the labor force in the middle of a recession is to take a hit to your lifetime earnings. It's not just a hit to a couple of years that you then sort of bounce back from. I didn't agree with a lot of the analysis of policies that led to the recession or that were responsive to the recession. In particular, I thought that the discussion of monetary policy and interest rates, although I had to laugh when he was talking about how monetary policy feels obscure to a lot of millennials. I can trust me that this is true for across the generations. That binds us all together. So, for example, there's a discussion of how the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate was lower in the 90s than in the 80s, and then lower still subsequently. Well, a lot of that is what you would expect when you've got a declining inflation environment, when you've got a declining risk premium. And it's an exaggeration of the extent to which there was a kind of policy choice toward lower interest rates. And an underestimate of the extent to which that's just sort of where market forces would lead you. And to the idea that over the last 10 years we've hurt millennial economic welfare by holding interest rates artificially low. I mean, to the extent that we can look at international evidence on this, I don't know that it's particularly promising for that thesis. If you look at the Eurozone area, for example, which tried to have a less expansionary policy, which raised interest rates in the middle of the Great Recession, I don't know if you'll find that the outcomes were particularly better for young people from doing that. I'll try to move along here. In general, I'm more optimistic about millennial economic outcomes than this book may lead you to be. On retirement security, for example, partly because I'm influenced by the work of Andrew Biggs at the American Enterprise Institute, I tend to think that there are some very important discrete problems, some of them highlighted very ably in the book about the entitlements, but that young people are saving at higher rates than previous generations, and that their material welfare is higher and is likely to continue to be higher than that of their predecessors. As is often the case with these sorts of analyses, there is a discussion about the change from defined benefit to defined contribution pension plans, and it's a balanced discussion that mentions some of the drawbacks of defined benefit plans. But at the same time, you usually ignore, and here it's also ignored, that most people didn't have access to those defined benefit plans to begin with. And if you look at what sort of your median worker is experiencing, it's a better retirement security situation than they had. I guess the last point I would make is that I don't, look, there's a lot of smart analysis about sort of what we should change with the education system, or sort of what's gone wrong with our education system, what's wrong with housing markets and so forth. And to the extent that you get young people, or younger than me people, interested in some of these topics and give them sort of a thesis that they can fit that analysis into, that's helpful. On the other hand, is theft really the right way to be thinking about this problem? Does it encourage the right kind of problem-solving mindset, or does it encourage really a kind of whiny ingratitude? Because, I think there have been some serious mistakes in education policy, some serious mistakes in monetary policy and so forth. Very few of them strike me as things which boomers did to enrich themselves at the expense of successor generations, which normally when we think of theft, we think of somebody taking something and enriching themselves. I don't think much that's in this book really lends itself to that thesis. I think it's what really come across in this book is a set of policies that people adopted for sensible reasons, although not always correctly, for understandable and non-larcenous reasons, but that in one way or another are working less and less well over time. And when a policy works less and less well over time, that means it's going to work less and less well for younger people. That, I think, is the real story that this book tells, and I think it's a very important and useful story.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you, and you've actually very helpfully given me a lot that I can bite into in my comments here. And I want to start with sort of what I take to be the big overarching theme of Ramesh's comments, which are that maybe it isn't so bad for the millennials after all. And to which I can only say that I think that Connor has given a very good, coherent explanation for why millennials don't think that way. And I think that we need to be really careful when we're talking about a lot of these issues that we, not lose sight of kind of of the actual valuable signal that the millennial perceptions of some of these problems are trying to tell us. I think that actually the politics around of this actually is a signal that even if, I'm sure that if you were looking at Connor's household balance sheet, or if you were looking at his various financial outcomes, you can come up with headline data that will tell a very positive story about that. And I think that can miss a lot of the dynamics that feel like they're going on at a household level. And I don't necessarily want to argue that one should never push back against a perception if you think that perception is wrong. But I think that one of the points that I wanted to make in the book is that we need to be alert to the fact that particularly in an environment where politically a lot of younger voters are telling us that they feel like something is going wrong economically for them, that actually is a signal that we need to take seriously. And I think that I'm trying to suggest that there might be things that are lurking beneath some of the headline numbers that suggest that there are actual problems going on here. And I'm certainly sympathetic to this argument that the generational issue is often overstated. I think that the term millennial itself had its origins in this book in the late 80s, early 90s, Generations, The History of America's Future, which I think made a lot of social claims about different generational cohorts that haven't really stood the test of time very well. But I think that it is reasonable to talk about these issues, these economic issues in generational terms, just because, whether by accident or by terrible luck it happens that that way you are capturing the effects on a cohort of the people who happened to be young at the time the Great Recession hit. And you can start talking about some of the economic implications of that. On issues like the monetary policy, the effect of interest rates, I think I'm not quite so inclined to let boomers off the hook for a lot of those decisions. Because one of the things that I found most striking as I was researching the book is just how little is still understood about both the practical effects of a lot of the monetary policies before and after the Great Recession, and the way that those policies interacted with the economy in the way that could have big implications for younger people who were entering the labor market then. There are some strands of research that are starting to suggest that actually the pro-growth benefits of Fed policies over the past decades were concentrated in areas that were already economically healthy, that they didn't necessarily do very much to lift boats in regions of the country that were struggling. There's growing reason to believe that those policies were really good for bigger companies that could borrow by accessing the bond markets. But they were a lot less helpful for smaller companies that might rely more on bank financing and also happen to be the companies that hire a lot of younger workers, like millennials in that marketplace. One of the things, again, and I mentioned this in my opening remarks on issues, particularly on monetary policy, but in a lot of other areas, so I think we do also need to push back against some of these notions that a lot of these trends were just inevitable. I don't think that there was anything inevitable about some of the trends in mortgage rates that we happened to see both before and after the crisis and the recession. I think that we're starting to see some interesting research that looks at the extent to which actually monetary policy itself might cause some of these phenomena that we then assume are just naturally happening because risk premium are falling or inflation is declining. Some of that is actually a choice. It's not a natural consequence of anything. And so I can certainly take the point that there will be a lot of argument about particular villains that I identify in the book or about what the policy solutions might be, but I don't think that we can let ourselves off the hook quite so easily by arguing that a lot of this stuff just kind of happened.
This has fascinated me. I came here prepared to say, one of my problems, I think, with the book is generational solidarity is not a thing, sort of echoing Ramesh, actually. I think the problem is rich people, not old people. This is a class solidarity issue, really. But now, I kind of need to stand up for millennial. I think I brought stats. I did a little research beforehand because, again, I was saying before in the green room, right? There's an article on millennial rage now that goes viral like every other week, pretty much. So I dug back and found a couple of these compelling stats. One of the fascinating things, if you don't think there's a problem, is to ask boomers how they paid for post-secondary education if they went. Have you ever done this? And the boomers in the audience, we should feel like I should ask you, but I remember talking to a relative who told me that she paid for college entirely with no debt. 4 years, private, no financial aid, working at a grocery store on break. That was it. She'd go home for Christmas, winter break, work all summer. That was it. Tuition, board, room, covered, everything. So I did a little research, dug this up. At minimum wage right now, for boomers, the hours of minimum wage work that it took to pay for 4 years of public college was 306. At minimum wage, you could pay for 4 years. For a millennial, now, on average, 4,459. We have 300% more student loan debt than our parents did. And we're half as likely to own homes. Now, it could just be that guys like me are whining. It could be. But I think that we do have some macro data that the current situation around credential creep, around zoning, around, I think, a bunch of things that are actually, conservatives are amenable to having a conversation about how we've made it immiserating to live near good job markets and what have you. I think there's good local exclusionary zoning policies that we can work across aisles on. But I don't think we should deny that people who are trying to put all the pieces together right now are facing a very weird and very expensive path upwards.
So I seem to have been slotted into this position of denying that there are problems that affect the economic welfare of millennials. It is not a role that I wish to play. what I do think is that focusing it in a generational way tends, first of all, to exaggerate the problem, and second, to exaggerate the sort of the maleficence or the idea that boomers made these terrible self-serving choices that are hurting the millennials. And just there are serious problems that we should work on tackling. The higher education, credentialism, the growth of licensing requirements, which again is just sort of would be absurd to regard through the lens of kind of generational self-interest. Why the number of job categories that require government licenses has expanded. I think that it is sort of an incidentally boomer-focused story. But then let's think about a boomer who was born in 1950, the height of the baby boom. He's becoming an adult. He's got a risk of going to Vietnam. The crime rate is high and rising. He's going to get into an economy where growth is significantly slower than it had been in the 1950s and 1960s. He runs into stagflation, something that the best and the brightest don't really have great answers to. And so it would be very easy to tell this same kind of story. Woe is us. Our predecessors have made terrible decisions, saddled us with these huge problems for which there aren't obvious solutions. We've also got the risk of, global thermonuclear war that'll destroy all of us. And it just seems to me, look, every generation gets both the assets and liabilities that have been handed down. And it's just not sort of useful or productive to concentrate on the liability side of that.
Well, I would just like to push back against that a little bit. First off, because I want to be clear to any boomers in the audience, it is safe for you to read this book. Because I do have a lot of sympathy for this argument, which, believe you me, I have heard quite a lot over the past week from older readers, that the boomers also faced a difficult economic environment. I think, and I discuss this at some length in the book. In fact, I think that this is a part of an explanation for the bad policy choices that the boomers themselves have made over the past 30 or 40 years. Because we often think about the boomers as inhabiting this halcyon era of stable employment where you could have the one family or the one earner household, and the wife, if she chose to, would have the option of staying at home to look after the children, and you would have the lifetime employment. The reality is that is the economy that the boomers grew up in the 50s or 60s. It is not the economy that they ever really worked in. And for boomers who were graduating and entering the labor market starting in the 70s, in the era of Vietnam, stagflation, and then through the traumas of the very early 80s as the American economy tried to recover from that. I have a lot of sympathy for the argument that the boomers did face a difficult time earlier in their working lives, which is why, for example, one other author who's looked at these issues has referred to them as a generation of sociopaths. You'll be relieved to think that I think that's unfair. I mean, the way I came to think about the policy side of this is that the boomers understood that something had gone wrong for them in the 70s, that the economy was not working the way it had for their parents. And a lot of what we've seen since then have been policy attempts to address those problems. Now, you can argue about whether you think that it was a theft or not, but I think that certainly the thrust of many of those policies, in effect, even if not entirely in intent all the time, has been to favor the interests of the boomers who were making the policies that they thought were intended to solve the problems that they had, rather than trying to take a somewhat more holistic view that might encompass an economy that would work, that would retain some kind of intergenerational balance. The housing market that led up to the crisis, I mean, to a fascinating degree, I realized that the real emphasis on homeownership in Washington actually had its origins in the 80s at a time when the boomers started to worry that they weren't buying houses in the proportion that their parents had. And you can't argue that boomer emphasis on housing just kind of happened by accident. I think that you can look at an awful lot of policy prods along the way that were intended to push boomers into home ownership without really thinking about what the broader effects on the market over time might be. I think that you certainly, and this is probably an area where Connor and I could have a very long disagreeing conversation with each other, but I think that one problem you can point to, especially in the Obama era, was this tendency to look for policy solutions that would recreate the appearance of the economic security that the boomers had grown up with. That could recreate the strong unionization, that could recreate the general feeling of economic security without focusing enough on recreating the productivity boom of the 50s and 60s that had created that kind of security. So, I think that it is entirely fair to have a conversation that talks about how some of these policy choices have created an economy that over time has lost a capacity to maintain some kind of intergenerational balance over time. Certainly I'm open to argument about whether or not you want to call that a theft, but the policy environment definitely happened.
I kind of feel like I need to just sort of let you guys finish this first.
We Gen Xers, we're not assertive, so I'll let you have the last word on that question for now.
But then let me actually, because I want to complain too. Because, I didn't agree with everything. Again, I'm still astonished to the degree to which sitting next to a Gen Xer, all of a sudden I actually felt the generational solidarity that I read your book and was, that's not a thing. So this has been fascinating for me. But one thing that actually, as the success sequence guy here, I'm about to have my third kid, and there was nothing in there about that chunk of millennial, which is, I think it's actually sort of the missing part of your big reveal at the end of the book. Actually, millennials aren't quite as young as you think, which is true. But insofar as you're talking about a cohort that's trending towards 40 at the upper edge, there's a lot of us who have now entered into the world of having children, which is enormously expensive. And also, again, just not there as part of this generational analysis. There's nothing in there really about the cost of childcare or about how having kids influences a bunch of your long-term professional trajectory, around long-term college savings. There's sort of occasional mentions around how instability around housing, either renting or home ownership, prevents people from forming families. But there's not a lot about once you're in there, how that actually contributes to this long-term, really difficult asset formation problem that millennials have.
Well, I think that is, again, a fair point. Part of the reason that maybe it felt a little less urgent to me when I was writing the book is just because the reality is that for a lot of people in the millennial cohort, family formation has been delayed by a lot of these tendencies. So I think that, especially when you put it that way, it is almost interesting that so much of the millennial political debate right now is focused on issues like home ownership or the student debt problem, or job security in general. I think that there is definitely some interest on some of these more family-oriented issues, but I think that maybe when we will reach a point when that discussion will become a lot more urgent. But for now, I think that if the family formation isn't at the point where huge numbers of millennials are grappling with that problem just yet, that might affect some of these dynamics. I think though that a lot of the solution to that is going to end up, being in issues like the labor market that I do talk about. I think that one way that I wish that we could start thinking about these issues, like the ability to have the resources to raise a family, I think that actually is an output of an economy. It's an output of an economy where investment is firing properly. It's an output of an economy that is seeing strong productivity growth. Since we aren't living in that kind of economy at the moment, that will create a lot of these knock-on stress factors. So even if I don't necessarily get into it in the book, I think that it's possible to extrapolate from some of the themes in the book into some of these other issues.
Could I just jump in on that? No, I think that millennials may not be sort of grappling with raising kids and the financial problems that creates, but maybe the reason they're not grappling with them is because of the financial problems that come along with kids. But it's not just the financial problems. I do think that there are a bunch of things that have come together and made it harder, both economically and culturally, for young people to start families. And there are, some places where I think we should be looking at those specific problems that we can tackle. And I think higher education is part of that, right? I mean, I think to the extent to which we have told a lot of people, again, not as a kind of generational conspiracy, it's been a big consensus that spans generations. Everybody's got to go to college, or they're going to be a loser for life, and you're not going to be able to afford it. I think that is something that has made people wait longer and longer before they start thinking about having kids, because I think that they need to build up these financial assets first, and that may be, again, higher education, childcare. Some of the issues around raising children specifically, as opposed to sort of looking at the economy in general, may be fruitful.
Well, there's no question. And for what it's worth, I have a column sitting with an editor right now. This is, if you look at the 2020 already primary campaign debate, it's notable we're not talking about K-12 hardly at all. There's very little in terms of K-12 education reform. But amongst the existing candidates, at least on the Democratic side, there's a ton on childcare proposals and various universal pre-K funding and ways to get at post-secondary costs. Like, they're absolutely pushing on exactly this, which, for what it's worth, again, like, this is the family economics of the you should adjust game. We looked very seriously at moving out of DC to the suburbs to another community a couple of times. Part of the problem is that we save about, well, with our 2 kids so far, it's about $20K a year for childcare in DC. So multiply by two kids, and since pre-K starts at 3 years old for full-day pre-K in DC, that's $80,000 of not spending we've done on childcare, because pre-K took over at 3 years old. If we move to the suburbs, we have to wait until kindergarten kicks in at 5 years old. So then you sit here and you say, well, I could save some money on housing, and in the long run, that's probably the better investment than not spending on childcare. But within our current income, I don't know we can actually swing that move.
Well, you should check with the internet. They've got a lot of constructive life advice.
Well, I just want to follow up on the should have just issue that you talked about, because I think that also ultimately is a terrific way of thinking about these problems and the way that the economy looks to millennials. Because, and again, speaking as someone of a more free market orientation on a lot of these issues, and particularly to an audience here at AEI, I think that there is room for people to be concerned that for so many millennials, success often seems to be not the product entirely of your hard work or your investment in yourself or your own training or your skills, but there also is this strong contingent element of it, and it does feel like it has become more contingent over time. And I think that it's useful for people on the conservative end of the spectrum to engage in that conversation, because then we can talk about policy origins from our side of the aisle that can help opening that up. I mean, for example, if you're looking at issues like inequality, which is a political preoccupation for millennials, I think that it's maybe good for us to be able to talk about that in terms of issues like how much is rent-seeking the deciding factor in economic success for at least some industries or companies in the economy, versus the old arguments that we used to have about these issues where you could plausibly argue that inequality is actually just a normal output of a properly functioning market economy. And that is a very different discussion from the discussion I think that people on the leftward end of the spectrum want to have about these issues. But I'm also not always sure that just ignoring some of these questions when millennials are telling us politically so loudly that these are preoccupations for voters of our generation. I think that just kind of saying, well, the boomers had it bad too, or every generation goes through something like this. I mean, first off, I don't think that that's entirely true if you look at the uniquely bad situation that millennials face, having graduated into the worst economy America had seen in 80 years. And I also think that that isn't going to be a really satisfactory political solution to some of these discussions that we have going on.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let me the last thing to say before we go to Q&A is, it's interesting to be at AEI and sort of hear a little bit almost like Marxist false consciousness argument. These millennials just don't understand, right? I'm willing to just trust them on the merits. That I think that it's not an accident that they're gravitating and moving left when they're finding, like moving far left. Because that's where they're finding answers to people explaining, look, you're dealing with a real challenge of just finding what looks like a clean path to putting your life together. The person, the party, the platform that gives a real answer to that, a meaty, substantive answer to here is how you're going to make it into some kind of financial security and long-term life cycle growth, they're going to control the political future. That's it. If you can speak to, and it doesn't have to be just millennials have had it bad and some unique millennial thing, it's that much like we like to talk about Europe, like if the problem in Europe is youth unemployment and that's fueling their radicalism, our problem is we have this sort of general sense amongst many people my age and younger that there just isn't a path up, and they sort of know who they see as the villains. I don't think we have to say that they don't understand. I trust them as individual, rational actors to really get this.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I've heard anybody say that millennials don't understand things and have suffered from false consciousness. So I'm happy to agree with that.
Okay, so we're going to turn to time for some questions here from you. And just my only rule, ours here at AEI, is that your questions are actually questions, and that you leave the extended remarks to our three speakers on the stage here. And Joe, if it's okay with you, I'll let you go ahead and just call on people as they do, so I don't need to be the middleman up here. But I will be the bad cop at the end and cut us off so that we get out of here on time.
Well, we had one
we have a roving mic
there,
here,
and then we'll go back there for the second question.
Good, and we do have a roving mic. Just please let that get to you before you ask your question. Thanks.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I'm going to take a comment of Ramesh's and turn it into a question. Since we're not in Sherwood Forest with Robin Hood and his merry band of thieves, the notion of stealing something implies that the person doing the stealing is trying to obtain something, is doing it for a self-oriented reason. And so I'm wondering whether there really has been a theft, or whether this was just a series of perhaps misguided policy decisions, and which do not really merit being called immoral, a word you use several times.
No, I think that you can think about it in terms of a theft just because the policy decisions always seem to be so oriented toward defending the economic interests of older voters over the potential interests of younger voters. I think that the housing example is a terrific instance of this because that was a situation where, especially after the financial crisis, the orientation of so much policy out of Washington was to try to keep people, older people who already own their homes, into those homes as much as possible, at the expense of any sort of thought about what the long-term implications of that might be in terms of distorting the market for younger buyers. And we've actually seen that those distortions are continuing to rack up. I think that a growing concern now is that after we've had this environment where interest rates on mortgages have been so low, especially for the past decade, suppressed by Federal Reserve policies, how many boomers are finding themselves locked into their homes because it's too expensive to borrow and take out a new mortgage if you have to move. And the amount of frustration that I've heard from millennials, including people about our age in their mid to late 30s about this situation. I had one email from a millennial woman who was complaining that she and her husband found it very difficult to buy a home in their community because they were discovering that there were so many boomers who had allowed themselves to become locked into these houses and were just basically squatting in houses that were too big for them, instead of allowing a normal life cycle to develop in that kind of market where they might downsize so that new families can rise up into that. And I'm sure that people will argue that we didn't mean it, and maybe it's a theft, maybe it's not a theft. But I think that if you look at it in aggregate, there has definitely been this bias in favor of older voters, often implemented by older policymakers. And I think it is entirely fair for us to ask, whether, especially over the past 10 years, this policy environment has adequately accounted for the situation that young people are finding themselves in.
Didn't the crisis result from too many people who really couldn't afford a home being allowed to buy one?
Yeah, and that was a consequence of a particular boomer era policy fixation on home ownership. And it's useful actually to phrase the question that way because part of my journey of discovery as I was writing the book is that I thought that so much of this was just going to have started at the Great Recession. I actually found that a lot of these phenomena I'm describing had their origins before that. That part of this is a much longer term story that just ended up getting worse as a result of the policy solution to the crisis itself. And that also is important to understand because there's a certain bipartisan element to this. I think that one warning, again, I would make for a more conservative audience here at AEI is to not think that Barack Obama is the only problem in terms of some of these policy issues. I think that we also have to have a discussion on the right side of the political spectrum about things like whether we got housing policy right in the run-up to the financial crisis when we had a Republican in the White House. I think we had a question over here.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, and I don't know whether I'll read your book, but do you have particular suggestions or recommendations for measures that could be taken short of the far left things that are being floated, especially in light of the fiscal situation of the federal government? Measures that could be taken to equalize, like shall I take a lot of money out of my retirement plan and give it to my children, or?
I didn't focus so much in the book on specific policy proposals because just as a reader, I often find my eyes glazing over a little bit if you get to the bulleted list in the last chapter of a book. And I think that what I'm trying to do is just find a way to state these problems that can trigger a bigger discussion about what the solution is going to be. I mean, you talked about fiscal policy, which is something that I discuss at some length in the book. It hasn't really come up here. But again, that is an instance where there is going to have to be a big discussion, and not just about getting the numbers to add up correctly, but also just about this matter of political choice and making sure that we don't allow allow social payouts to boomers under some of the old age entitlements completely swallow up the scope that millennials will have to make our own fiscal decisions as we do start getting elected to Congress. So that's an example of how I almost think that it's helpful to get a little beyond just thinking about it in terms of technocratic levers that you can try to pull or having a bulleted point list in the back of the book and try to think a little more holistically about what some of these problems are. I think as Connor pointed out, it is undeniable that the political response to this among millennials so far has been to shift to the left and very far to the left. And I think it is because there is a certain appeal to having politicians that will at least recognize that some of these factors I'm describing are problems. Now, I think that you can have a really interesting argument pointing out that a lot of those solutions on the far left are not the right solutions, that they actually threaten to make some of these generational balances worse. But before you can even engage in that kind of argument, you have to have a clear understanding about exactly what the problem is. And I think that's the way that I'm trying to move the ball forward down the field with the book as much as any thought about offering specific what do we do now policy ideas.
If I could just jump in on the fiscal stuff, where I think we probably agree on a lot. And if you think about Social Security, for example, where the key decision is really made in 77 to move to a wage index for benefits. So a time, I might add, when people at the midpoint of the baby boom were about 22 years old and not in charge. And there's been no real change in Social Security except a modest scale back in the mid-'80s since then. And everything's been running on autopilot, and nobody's really fixed that. And it does seem to me that eventually you are going to have to either raise taxes, probably with the burden of that falling on upper middle class people under about 55, or you're going to have to cut benefits, probably with the burden of that falling on upper middle class people under about the age of 55. And so you basically, who you want to be paying most of this bill, and it's just a question of how exactly that's structured and whether we work up the will to do it.
There's a question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Yaya Fanusi. I like his approach because I meet a lot of millennials and I'll discuss with them. And they'll tell me all of these things because this is basically an academic issue. And I always say to them, what are you going to do about it? And they have not a clue. I came to this country in 1967 as a private student. I faced not similar, but situation constraints. I figure out, like most of us who came, figure out how to solve it. So did you, in your study, get a few of them who make some suggestions, like the gentleman there was trying how he was navigating all this problem? I think what needs to be done is for these millennials to start thinking to become entrepreneurial in how they solve their problem rather than going through the path that has been established as a route.
No, I think there's definitely going to be an aspect of that, and I hope that we're going to see a lot more intellectual entrepreneurship out of the millennial generation. I mean, on a certain level, I find this tilt to the far left, favoring politicians like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren a little mystifying, because you have this young generation that is all about the hip and the new and the high tech, and yet we are embracing economic philosophies that have their origins in the Victorian era. And a bunch of older politicians, coming out of, either socialist movements in Vermont or faculty lounges. How much? I sometimes find myself wondering how much do they really understand about the situation of, millennials. So, I mean, one of the things that I'm hoping is that, particularly as we start aging into that, period of our lives where we do become more politically active, where we do get ourselves elected to Congress, that we can have that discussion, and I think it'll be really helpful on, particularly the left right now, but also potentially on the right, if we can kind of separate ourselves out a little bit from, what our elders are trying to tell us and actually engage in some new entrepreneurial thinking for our own about what the policy solutions to these problems might be.
I would just caution that socialism isn't maybe, it's not the new Drake album, but it's not as old as capitalism, right? I mean, Locke and Mandeville and the underpinnings of our existing economic organization are older, just as far as that joke goes, but also I want to believe there's an entrepreneurship boom coming too. I have my own, oddly enough, I'm a very minority stake holder in my family's brewery out in Seattle, which, shout out to Flying Lion. But entrepreneurship is risky, and what I think you're going to find is that for millennials who are barely able to chart a path towards paying down some student debt and get some kind of secure housing near a job that would help them put their lives together, taking entrepreneurship risks is not high on it doesn't feel safe. They've already been taking a lot of risks. They took $100,000 worth of debt or so to get their undergraduate degree, and now you're telling them, well, launch yourself out there with some idea and see if you can make it in the battle place of the market. I mean, that's a tall order for people who are living pretty precarious lives already.
If I could jump in on, we've circled around this discussion of sort of millennial politics a few times here. seems when you're thinking about why millennials are voting as heavily Democratic as they are and seem to be favoring socialism over capitalism to a higher extent than previous generations, there's a couple different things going on. One, you're actually, I think, not seeing a real increase in support for socialism so much as you're seeing a decrease in support for capitalism. And that's, I think, for some of the reasons we've discussed here, that particularly the last 10 years, graduating into this labor market and so forth, that it's been a kind of traumatic experience for a lot of people. And then the second thing, which Joe mentions in his book, but which I think conservatives are sometimes, in a way, sort of too hung up on the generational thing to focus enough on, a lot of it is that young people are less white than older people. And everything we have seen in politics for the last 50 years suggests that that means you're going to have more Democratic and less Republican voting behavior. So I guess what I would say there is, there's an economic component to that, but we can be as pro-avocado toast as possible if conservatives don't do better among Hispanics and Asians and blacks. They are going to do worse among young people than they do among older people. That is just demographic reality.
Do we have time for one more? Do we have one more question? Or I think we've got, do we have time for two more questions? Okay, why don't we maybe do you and then you there.
That one where you can choose which one we actually want to answer.
So I'll start. I'm John Dolan. I'll start by saying I think finding common ground is a great place to go forward on this argument, and I am sympathetic to the plight, the economic plight that millennials have. And I think that if you couch discussions in that framework as opposed to theft, you'll have a more receptive audience going forward. I think the other element that is I'll pose in the form of a question is the blame is misfocused in my mind. I've not heard, having not yet read the book, the role of globalization. I heard a hint at the astronomical increase in the cost of education, but I've not heard specifics as to what to do about that. So I would say, what are you going to do about introducing your audience to the notion that globalization might have a role as opposed to blaming another generation? And what are you going to do about the cost of education going forward?
Okay. And then we had a question here.
Might be a longer response on your side, but thank you. With 22 people coming into the Democratic run for president, and all of these promises.
3 more this morning. We don't know. It's we've been stuck.
More.
No. See, but you thought it could happen.
I totally expected it.
But do you think with the burden of student debt is kind of the catalyst to the demise or evolution of the conservative movement? Because for example, I have friends who are lifelong Republicans, conservatives out in Cincinnati, Ohio, rural Cincinnati, Ohio, who hear, hey, Elizabeth Warren is saying $50,000. And I'm going to break from my party to do that because it's in my self-interest. So what is your take on the promises that are going to keep on coming?
Okay, well, on the globalization question, that is something that I touch on, a little bit in the book, because that was actually the big issue that the boomers were grappling with through most of their economic lives. I mean, remember, one of the contributing factors to a lot of the disruptions that the boomers experienced in the 70s and into the 80s was the fact that the American economy had been so unusual in the 50s and 60s because major competitors like Japan and West Germany had been completely offline as they were recovering from the war. Now, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting is that, and you can kind of see this a little bit if you start looking at some survey results on millennial attitudes toward issues like trade. I mean, my sense, and I'm curious to get Connor's view on this, is that we just take it for granted that we are living in a more globalized economy now. And so from that perspective, at least on the conservative side right now, someone like President Trump is probably a distraction for us, because when I see a lot of his fulminations on trade policy, it actually sounds like something straight out of the conversations that the boomers were having with themselves in the 80s, because that really, I think, is where a lot of his rhetoric this started. In fact, I found a New York Times clipping at one point of him in the 80s claiming that if only he had been in charge of negotiating trade policy with Japan instead of Reagan, America would have gotten a much better deal. So, I think that one of the interesting policy challenges that millennials face is that we are going to be making economic decisions in an environment where we are actually taking for granted some of the phenomena that the boomers didn't take for granted in terms of globalization or trade. And that might open up an interesting discussion. I mean, on the student debt issue, I think that it is undeniable that the fact that you have some politicians who are talking about this and seem to be holding out a solution is a big draw for a lot of younger voters. Now, the problem is, and this is something that I think that we need to, at least on the rightward end of the spectrum, need to be a lot more frank talking about, is that you have to ask whose money are some of these politicians being generous with. And the reality is that if you look at the age ranges of the different cohorts in the population right now, so much of this generosity is actually going to be at the expense of millennial taxpayers. So, on the one hand, you can understand why people are drawn to that argument, but on the other hand, you get a little frustrated that, we often talk about this issue on the right in terms of, not wanting the state to get too involved, or the fiscal mechanics of just thinking about it in terms of dollar terms, and we aren't thinking about the fact that some of these politicians are actually giving us gifts with our own money. And I think that is an opportunity to engage in some of these discussions, as long as you're starting from the premise that this is actually a serious problem and there is a big political demand for a solution to it.
So, excuse me. It just seemed to me that there are different pieces of the student debt puzzle that I think vary in their urgency. And they sometimes get lumped together in a misleading way. So I'm not so much concerned about people who finish school with really high debt burdens, but are also on a path towards high lifetime incomes, partly as a result of that borrowing. Where I am concerned is the people who have gotten a significant amount of debt, often not the highest, but a real debt burden, and then did not finish. Did not get the degree. Because what we're seeing is, first of all, that's a lot of people. And second, that the economic outcomes for people who have some college are actually closer to those of high school dropouts than they are to those of college graduates. And one of the things that, in a way that's a narrowing of the problem, but in a way maybe it's a broadening of it too, because maybe the way to think about this is that we have a system that is geared towards getting people to finish high school, enroll in college, graduate college, and get a job that requires a college degree, and that is the path to success that we are aiming for, and it works for only 1 out of 6 young people in America. And maybe we need to look at this entire system and try to move away.
And I would just say that is a nuance that I talk about in the book.
Yes, that's right.
And it is a frustration of a lot of these debates that are happening on the Democratic side right now, because the student debt crisis is not among people who owe more than $100,000 of student debt. That's only about 5% of the total number of borrowers. The default rates are much lower than people who owe smaller amounts. I mean, speaking as a journalist, and at the risk of offending my brothers and sisters in the profession, I will argue that one of the reasons that people think that is where the crisis is because those borrowers are probably disproportionately represented in the social circles of a lot of reporters. But we do need to, and it would be nice, again, if we could engage in a somewhat more nuanced discussion instead of always getting wrapped around the axle of something like the Elizabeth Warren plan that seems to be contemplating repaying large amounts of student debt for people who actually don't need the help, and potentially at the cost of all millennials in terms of the tax burden of doing that, including the taxes that would ultimately be levied on people who do need the help.
This is an important discussion, and I hate to cut it off, but we are at time. So great questions, great discussion, and I'd like to point out that given the hostility with which the internet and Twitter talks about these issues, I'd like to celebrate the civility with which we discuss them today. So please join me in thanking Joe Sternberg and our panelists.
right, D. Mike.